Hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm here. You know what? It's that classic turn it on, turn it off, turn it back on, right? Huge. Winning. All right, here we are. We are back in action, and it is family law, and it's April 11th, not quite the 12th. What happened there? And so we're at the part that is of the family law chapters that is in the subject matter of family law that's outside the big core, which is divorce and child custody and all those things that we see regularly. That's the big core. And so we're saying some of the other areas that are family law, and then there's a whole other area that we don't really cover a ton of, and that is the abuse and neglect law. And that's a whole different ball of wax itself. I just want to remind you that there is the big course project that's out there, so you should be working on that. Really, we're winding down in the class. Other than after today, we're going to cover adoption and the new science and motherhood a bit. Next week, we'll talk about torts and family law. Don't forget that you need to do the assignment before you come or before class, because we're going to talk about some things related to the torts and family law and all the things that are in that area, which there's some unique areas of law that we're seeing develop out of in this area that I think is worth looking into and discussing a little bit. So just keep that in mind. If you have any questions about the project, make sure to let me know and keep working on that. So it's a big handbook type thing, so you should see that. All right, so right, go ahead.
Handbook?
Yeah, it's a big handbook. No, it's a handbook that it should answer all the questions, right?
Are we talking about a pamphlet? Or are we talking
It could be, it's probably going to be a couple more pages than a pamphlet, but there could be multiple pamphlets. Yeah, you should present it in some way. We can talk about that next time about what that means to present it, okay? I'll give you a better firm target about what that means, okay? Yeah, I'm thinking of that pamphlet. There's some golf commercial, and the guy's got a pamphlet for everything. Have you seen that? Anyway, it's a funny commercial. Anyway, so we'll work out those answers. Let me feed me any of those kinds of questions you have, and then I'll email them out to everybody when I have responses to those things, okay? And we'll cover it next time. That way we can get through the material today, talk about that subject next time, and then you'll have about a week to be ready for presenting and how we go about doing that. All right? Okay, any other questions about that? All right, so we're in chapter 13, but really we're talking about adoption. That's the most important part of this subject. Adoption is a huge part of family law. We actually, one of the things that, you know, in the system, what's interesting about family law is it's actually one of the fun times that you're involved in family situations. Usually people are happy to be adopted, right? And that's a good thing. That's a good system. Family's happy to be adopting. And we used to think those were the most fun when I worked in the court system, because people were generally happy in these situations. But with that, there's a lot of terminology. Adoption is really at its core, it means one big thing, and that is that you are essentially terminating the rights of the biological parent or parents and giving those the legal rights that are associated with being a biological parent, terminating that and giving that to a new parent who is what we call adoptive parent, okay? And an adoptive parent is someone who's seeking to adopt, basically. Because once the adoption is complete, they're just a parent then. There's no more adoptive. In other words, what happens in an adoption is the old parents, the parents with the original legal parental right, that is terminated, and there is a new right set up. Okay, we'll see an exception to that pretty quickly, but that's what adoptive parents are. Basically, they just stand in the place of a biological parent. For all legal purposes, that's what we do. There are some complicated things about adoption that don't always fall in line with that concept, and we'll talk about the one big one here in a minute, and then there's another one where a kid actually in a lot of states can reject the adoption once they turn age 18, which is kind of an interesting point. You can actually like undo an adoption because the kid can like say they don't want to have been adopted. Kind of a weird little scenario. In any event, let's go through a couple of terms that we know. Adopted parent, I already told you. Custody and legal custody are actually can be different things. Use physical and legal custody. You know what those are. A ward is the person who is basically appointed a guardian. All right. The ward, we call them wards of the state when we talk about when the state takes custody of a kid. A guardian is the person who is now in charge of the child. That doesn't have to be an adoption. That could be when you make either a private agreement. That's possible to have private agreements. I'll tell you, sometimes if I ever would go on vacation with my children or without my children and my children stay with their grandparents or something to that effect, I sometimes would grant, depending on how long it was or where I was going, I might grant, a temporary guardianship to my parents or their grandparents so that they can make all the legal decisions for them in the meantime. Sometimes you can do it less dramatically by giving them authority to make medical decisions, for instance, for kids. It's a good idea to do those kind of things. But a guardian is the actual person who would take care of them in the stead of the parent. A guardian ad litem is a different thing. It has that same name, but guardian ad litem typically is someone who represents the kid in legal matters. Okay. And traditionally, that has been lawyers, but it does not have to be. Some states don't have lawyers aren't always guardian ad litems, but typically they are. West Virginia, we typically always appoint a guardian ad litem. In other words, what are they? They're their guardian for legal purposes. Because remember, a minor, someone under age 18, cannot make legal decisions for themselves. They can't enter into contracts. They can't really fully represent themselves. So that person is actually the kid for legal purposes. Okay, that's what a guardian ad litem does. They represent their interest. Usually it's a lawyer because the lawyer, it serves two purposes. The lawyer then represents them and the lawyer is them for legal purposes. Okay. If you're incarcerated, you can also be granted a guardian ad litem because if you're in jail, you lose some of your legal rights and a guardian can be appointed for you. Another couple terms, we have paternity. We already talked about that and discussed that area. We know what that is, I think. That's a big piece of family law. Foster care is essentially it's like temporary, it's almost like a temporary adoption. That's when a family is taking care of a child in foster care. The foster care really replaced the old concept of orphanages and some of those things. A very important part of the system because when the state takes kids away from their parents and they become the guardian for them, where do they actually go? The state isn't actually a person, right? It's a legal person, but who's going to actually take care of them? That's what foster care is when you become an agent for the state in that area. A step parent, I think you know who that is, right? That's someone who is married to a biological parent, and that's a step parent. So that's the adoption. Adoptions are pretty straightforward. They're a legal proceeding. You file them. You have to set forth certain qualifications to be the adoptive parent, and then the court grants that. Okay, a typical adoption is very simple in the sense of the legal end of it. It's that we terminate the rights of the biological parents and we grant new parental rights to the now legal parents. Okay, so that's the traditional way. In the most adoptions, all of the parental rights for all the biological parents are terminated. Okay, they're done. Now we get to another area which sometimes is called second parent. It's usually step parent adoption. And a second parent or step parent adoption is a different subject. So why is a step parent adoption possibly different? What about even the thought process? So again, remember the original way, the main way you see an adoption is you terminate the parental rights of all of the biological parents, so both of them usually, and you now have the new legal parents. That's what an adoption looks like. You've terminated the biological parents' rights. Okay, they're no longer the parents. Now you have new parent. What is different potentially about a step parent adoption?
Step parent adoption, parent must assent to the adoption.
Okay, so the step parent has to agree to be the parent, right? But what causes the problem with what is different that you bring them into the adoption proceeding? What happens? Are you desiring to terminate the parental rights of the other parent, one of the parents, or both of the parents, or just one of them in a step parent? I'm sorry, that was not a very well said statement.
I think I get what you're saying. I think biological parent that's no longer in the picture has to relinquish their rights before the step parent can officially adopt the child.
Right. So a step parent, in other words, what was said was one of the parents has to relinquish their rights, and the other one is maintaining their rights. Okay. So that's the concept of a step parent adoption. So let me say it in a general sense. Husband and wife have a child together. Okay. They get divorced. The child lives with mom. Okay. Dad becomes less than part of the life of the child, maybe moves somewhere else, whatever happens, they're gone. Okay. They're not regularly in the life of the child. Mom remarries, okay, and now the child is used to the stepdad being the only real dad the child knows, okay? At some point in time, the relationship might want to be formalized, right? That is my dad. I want him to adopt me. My biological father, I don't even know who that is. I would like him to be my dad legally, not just in the psychological sense, but in the legal sense, right? And so in that case, there's a good reason to do that, right? You formalize that. You want that to be, it's a big gesture, right? But do you want to terminate the rights of mom? No. A traditional adoption, that's how it would work. You terminate all the biological rights and you give it to a new legal parent. You don't want that in a step parent adoption. You want this other person, the step parent, to become also a parent. Okay? While at that point you will terminate then the biological right of the biological parent, the other one. In the situation, an example I gave, the biological dad is no longer dad, right? Makes sense, right? There's good reason to do that. The other factor that plays in those kinds of circumstances is has to do with who inherits, because what happens when you adopt is that you become, or the child becomes a direct descendant or an heir of the new parent, of the legal parent, the adopted parent. So what happens in the circumstance, and here's an example that comes up in the law from time to time, is that dad passes away or mom passes away, mom or dad get remarried, and then they have a step-parent adoption. Should child still be able to inherit from biological parents? Okay, so his or her grandparents. Should that be allowed? Most law says yes, as long as the biological parent predeceased the adoption. Okay, died before it. So you see why you might want to do that? Is that a typical situation? Probably not, but can you see the need to want that? In other words, remember what the polar star is in family law there were cases involving children, is the best interest of the children, right? And then if you remember the cases we had that talked about, particularly the case that I gave you out of West Virginia that had to do with where dad had to pay child support and still be dad even though he didn't want to be anymore, right? Because he wasn't biological father. What was the court's reasoning in that case? It's good for kids to have parents, right? I mean, in essence, so the polar star is best interest. The second part is really that usually the best interest is to have two parents, right? So we want to encourage that kind of thing to happen. We want people to have that if they want it, right? If it makes sense. So just thinking about that outside of that, you have a problematic part, and really the question I'm asking is, in a step-parent adoption, you need it to be a little different rule because you don't want to terminate the rights of the one parent that's involved there in the marriage, right? Okay. Good deal. All right, how do you do it?
If you don't do a legal adoption,
Right.
can you run into issues with that? Or
If there isn't a legal adoption, no, I mean, just it depends. In terms of other areas of law, you can't inherit from a step parent without them writing it in the will, for instance. Generally, then a stepchild cannot sue for wrongful death of the parents. There's some areas like that that could be, but those are the only real pitfalls that you might find. But there aren't a lot of consequences to not. Typically, the reason for that adoption more than anything is to establish that bond in the legal sense. It's almost more of an emotional remedy than it is anything else, right? It's a grand gesture that I want this person to be formally my dad or mom, So, but we want to make that exception because it's a good one, right? It has a good justification, which you'll see from time to time, not always, but law tries to be good to people. And that isn't always, but tries. Okay, so how do you go about adopting a child? Well, there are basically 4 different types that we find. We have independent adoptions where those are agencies. You actually work it out amongst the parents. Sometimes there's a connection. People will almost hunt for adoptions and do that independently. We have public agencies. I just drew a blank on what it was called. Typically, what we see, public agencies are involved when there was an abuse and neglect case and the court has terminated parental rights and there wasn't a given an adoption. The agency there's an agency that's a public agency in the area that we live in that does that, but they arrange adoption through DHHR. Basically, they're an agent for DHHR. You'll have licensed private agencies. Those are the regular ones. I mean, those are when folks are looking to adopt, that kind of thing. International adoptions, I think we're aware of those a lot of times. Probably some of the most famous international adoptions are Madonna. Madonna has some famous international adoptions, right? And Brangelina or whatever they go by, right? But they're split up now. They're big ones that have a lot of international adoptions, right? But they're not alone. There are a lot of people who have had those from all over different parts of the world. And the biggest issue with an international adoption is whether or not it is formalized and appropriate under United States law. So what a lot of times we have in international adoption, it has to do a lot also with immigration and visas and naturalization. If you do an international adoption, you adopt a child in another country, how do you get them to the United States? Well, you have to have a formal adoption in another country in order to allow you to get those travel visas to get in the country to establish citizenship. Okay, so what happens is then you have this foreign adoption. You have that foreign adoption, but it might not be recognized by Ohio or United States law. So what a lot of times you'll see in those is the second adoption, where you'll actually have, when you come back to the United States, then you formalize it into that state law that you live in, just to make sure it's a solid and that there's no holes to be poked into it. Okay, good question. And Marissa asked, I know someone who was adopted at age 2. The adoptive parents had interest in adopting him as soon as he was born. Does it really take that long for the process to happen? Yes and no. There's a minimum waiting period, I think, that the kid has to be at least 6 months old in most states. I know that's in West Virginia, 6 months old. Then before you can file the petition for adoption, and then once it's filed, there's another 90-day waiting period in the procedure. Okay, so you have to wait 6 months to file a petition. Once you file it, there's 90 days for the notice period. So, right there, you're getting to be 9 months, pretty quick. So just in the law, at least takes 9 months for an adoption to occur formally. And okay, that's 6 months after the birth. So does it take 2 years? It could. If there's any contest to the adoption, it can take longer, because you do get the right, if you're not willing to, what we'll call, and we'll talk about this in a minute, relinquish your parental rights, if you're not willing to do that voluntarily, then there has to be a determination by the court to terminate your parental rights for another reason. There are different ways to do that, and we'll talk about the three main ways that you terminate parental rights. But so it could take 2 years, especially if there's a contest. So to give you an example, a lot of times what you'll see in adoptions is that the mother is pregnant and identifies people who are looking to adopt, or vice versa. They identify each other some way. Sometimes it's happenstance. I remember one that occurred when I worked in the court system. Literally, the ultrasound tech or the radiology tech was doing the ultrasound for the girl that was pregnant, and she was just the ultrasound or the radiology tech couldn't. They were having trouble conceiving and that kind of thing, and it just came up in some way while that was going on, and the girl that was getting the ultrasound offered, well, I was looking to have my child adopted, and that's how they connected. So kind of by happenstance, is how it worked. But in that case, though, and this wasn't in that particular one that I'm aware of, but what could happen is once that's filed, maybe mom doesn't know who dad is, or it has no contact with dad, doesn't know how to get contact with him. Who knows what happened in the meantime? But they file it, okay, so they know they're going to adopt. They even took the child home at birth, right? I mean, that's common too. That's what happens, and probably in this situation that Marissa points out. Then they wait the 6 months, they file the petition, and when they do that during the 90-day window, dad finds out he has a child now, and then didn't really want the adoption because dad didn't even know the child was coming, right? And so you see those kind of wrinkles that can come up in adoption. But I just want to point those out. So the next topic after that, after international adoption, which is what we were talking about, is a very closely related area, and that has to do with the black market adoptions. And in international, a lot of times what they are could be somewhat high dollar adoptions that are done on the black market, not through a formal legal or public process. Okay, you can see the problems with those, right? In the United States, these are clearly illegal. You may not have black market adoptions. Okay, what do you think is what is the legal reason that you can't have these kind of pay to adopt type adoptions?
First of all, you wouldn't have any way, of knowing exactly on a paper trail. There's not going to be a birth certificate or anything like that.
Okay, so you're not, no paper trail. You both pointed that out. Exactly. You're not going to have a way to formalize it because no one's willing to legitimize it, right? They're a little bit, concerned about that. Now, obviously, in this whole process of adoption, there are expenses, right? If I'm going to adopt your child is born, and usually there are medical expenses that occur at their birth, right? They're born in the hospital. There's those kind of payments. Is it reasonable to have to pay those for an adoption? Sure, it is, right? Only makes sense. It's your child, really. I mean, that's what we're doing. Other, early childhood care and all that, child visits and all that stuff. It makes sense that you pay those expenses. So, does it make sense that you would pay for the paperwork? Does it make sense you would pay the public agency or the licensed private agency for their services in arranging it? Sure it does. So there's cost there. And so there's obviously an exchange of money in some cases, but black market adoptions when you pay a premium above cost. That's one way to do it. But what's the problem with this pay to adopt system is that you're not allowed to buy people, right? I mean, ultimately that's the problem. You can't buy people. That's illegal, right? How do we know that's illegal in the United States?
Slavery.
Yeah, and we outlawed slavery, right? So there's a constitutional amendment on that one, and we don't always think about it that way, but that's what it is. You can't, people aren't property. That isn't the concept. And human trafficking is bad, indeed. Absolutely. But didn't they make, what was that? There were like more than one movie about that, weren't there? Taken, when isn't that about human trafficking?
Yeah.
Or both of them? Were there 2 or 3 of those?
Taken, I think they were doing a lot of prostitution.
Which is the large part of human trafficking, really. Yeah, which I didn't know that. I went to a conference on about human trafficking. I had no idea that it was mainly about prostitution. Anyway, pretty wicked stuff. To be honest. Anyway, not that I thought that it was like all roses or anything to begin with. So, okay. Anyway, that moving on past that, the next question is, who may be adopted? You may be surprised to know that adults can be adopted, right? So I think that's an interesting point. Why would you adopt an adult?
If they don't have to have.
It didn't come through well. Because something? They're elderly. People who can't care for themselves, they might adopt. Legal purposes more than anything, most likely to be inheritance or something to that effect. The other big area of adult adoptions over time, that's the main reason, has to do with taking care of people, formalizing those relationships as you get older, things like that. And then there was a whole nother area, and it actually, strangely enough, came out of, oh shoot, it was a rock guy that,
Dwayne Johnson?
no, not The Rock, but rock and roll singer guy who actually adopted his girlfriend because she was under age 18. That was an interesting adoption because in the state you were allowed to see I can get grandma's money. You can already get grandma's money in a legal sense. But he adopted his girlfriend when she was under age 18, so that's not an adult adoption. So because the law said that you can't live with an unmarried woman under the age of 18 or something like that. Anyway, moving on past that. Then there was a whole nother area that came out of adult adoptions, and an associated subject had to do with homosexual marriages. Okay, not marriages, but homosexual relationships. And there were adult adoptions that were occurring because you could formalize that relationship so you could get inheritance, for one thing. You could also get, okay, you might have tax purposes, but you have a dependent deduction. Okay, you would take advantage of some of the marriage privileges and things like that in the law. And then one of the things that really struck out, particularly in those kinds of in those relationships, was you couldn't get the right to visit your partner in the hospital. You had no say over it, and that was one of the biggest areas actually of all, was that, well, now I can't go in and help make medical decisions because I'm not related, okay? And I can't be married because the law didn't allow it. So those are the factors. I think that's less of an issue today than it used to be because of gay marriage and all those things that gives those privileges back. So it's kind of become less necessary, and adult adoptions generally are pretty rare. I've seen a few of them actually in the time. They were mostly people who, after they turned age 18, wanted to formalize their relationship with the person who really was their parent most of their life, and starting back when they were kids. So it makes sense, and it allows those people to formalize those relationships even after they're adults. I think it was good in the situations that I knew about. Okay, who may adopt? The biggest question is whether or not it's in the best interest of the child. And we look at a kinship preference, but it's not a guarantee. We don't absolutely require it. Okay, we tend to want family to be adopting, but we tend to do that. That isn't, by no means, that's not the rule. It's always the best interest of the child. We look at some factors, and actually in some states, in West Virginia, I forget exactly how much older you have to be than the child, but there's an age factor, and it is that the adoptive parent must be at least so many years older. It's like 15 years older than the child. Okay. Why that's in the law, I don't know. I guess it makes sense that so you're not 20 and you adopt your 17-year-old girlfriend, I guess, or boyfriend. I suppose that maybe has some bearing on it. I can't imagine that that's enough of it to make a law about it, right?
Sounds like incest to me.
But you have age, so yeah, well, then that's the difference between legal and biological, right? But in any event, you have to be at least so much older, and why, I don't know. But you do see that. I suppose because you want it to be to establish a parent-child relationship as opposed to a sibling relationship or something that is that. We typically have a preference for married married adoptive parents. That's not, by no means, that's not a given. And that is evolving all the time. We want there to be good health factors on both sides, so we don't typically want an elderly person adopting, a young child. Though we see that a lot today's society. Actually, a lot of grandparents are raising children. That's pretty common. And I know people that are great grandparents. They're raising pretty young children. So you give an example, an 18-year-old adopting a 16-year-old. Yeah, I mean, I think we don't want those kind of situations. We want a parent-child relationship. Race, there is generally not allowed to use race as the determining factor in an adoption. However, there is an exception for American Indians. Okay? Why do you think that is? I'm putting just one person on the spot, but there is actually a separate set of laws that relate to the American Indians, okay, and the native folk and Native Americans, basically, including the Inuits and all the people in the reservations, because truthfully, Indian reservations are a different country than the United States. And so we have a little bit, and part of the deal that was struck in those situations, in that movement to reservations, was related to giving that there's always a preference for the tribes to adopt their own, okay? And that had to do, I think, more with continuity of the tribes and things like that. But there is a special preference for that in the law. If you have like any case, actually in a divorce action, you will see that that the court makes that finding in most states, whether or not the either of the parents are American Indian or protected by and I can't think of the name of the act, but there is a different thing. So it can be the sole factor. There is a heavy preference there. Religion, typically, that's one of the factors, whether or not the child desires to be adopted. There's a sliding scale of age about when the child can determine their own wishes for that. Typically, by the age of 14, the child can make that call. Anyway, the law, like I already told you, allows in some states, and West Virginia is one of them, that the child, once they reach age 18, can nullify the adoption. So I suppose it makes sense to ask them then when they're 14 or some age, if they're just going to undo it in a couple years, we can do that. Economic status is one of the factors. It's really only to the extent that there are sufficient resources to care for the child. It doesn't mean everyone gets to live with Bill Gates. It means that you have sufficient resources. What does that mean? That's a pretty loose standard, probably. And we want to make sure that there's a solid home environment and morality of the home. Those are just factors to consider. Okay, all those things. I already touched on gay and lesbian adoption, so I can move on past that. Procedure: how do we go about the adoption? Typically, we file it in the jurisdiction and venue where the child lives, and we file a petition. And the biggest key here is that you have notice in the due process, which means that we're giving notice to biological parents, and we're giving due diligence that we locate the father. How do we find out where the father could be? Okay, you have to notify the father even if you don't know who the father is. Now, how confusing is that, right? So how do you do that? How do you know where to notify the father and you don't even know who they are?
Public notice?
Okay, how do you do that?
newspaper or?
Yes, right? Newspaper by publication, right? Now, then the question is, where do you publicize? Which newspaper do you pick?
Where the child lives, the jurisdictional area, or is that too simple?
Okay, that's part of it. Where does the child live? Yes, that's the first place. Clearly, you have to do it there. Where else? What if dad, you have no reason to believe dad lives where child lives? Where do you do it? You don't know where they're from, but you know they're not from, the child maybe wasn't even conceived in the county or the state where the child lives, right?
Can you trace anything through the parent's birth certificate?
Well, if you knew who they were, you could.
Okay, that's right. Never mind.
But in other words, you also publicize where the child was conceived.
Okay.
And you'll see that from time to time. So you figure that there are a decent number of those that are in the Vegas newspaper, right? I don't know. That was just a joke. Yeah, I guess we're not allowed to know because what happens there stays there. Okay. So anyway, you'll see that. That's another factor. You have to do due diligence. You can't just say, I have no idea and not try. You have to try to locate the father, in those processes. Notice is really important. Like we already said, you have the 6 months after you're born to file a petition, and you have the 90 days of the notice period. So then we have the next thing, and in order to have an adoption, you have to have the consent of the parents, and there are 3 main ways to get the consent. One of them is actually consent, and the other 2 really aren't, okay? And what is consent to allow an adoption? The first is the relinquishment. This is a voluntary process wherein the parent fills out a formal paper, which is actually in the state code. You can find that paper where they sign all the things they have to agree to and understand all their rights, where they voluntarily relinquish. That one's truly consent. Okay. The other 2 aren't really consent; they're by other actions. Termination is when the state terminates your parental rights due to an abuse neglect petition. Okay. So that's not voluntary usually. Sometimes there are voluntary relinquishments that come out of the deal that is made in order to resolve an abuse neglect case. But for the most part, a termination is not voluntary. That's when the court determines that the parental rights are terminated. And really the only one you'll generally see, because relinquishment and termination are done before you file a petition typically. So, you'll get that paperwork with the petition. But the one that may be part of a dispute is an abandonment consent claim. And an abandonment is basically where it's proven to the court that the biological parent has abandoned the child. What does that mean? Basically, that means that you have had no contact with the kid for 6 or more months. You've not paid child support. You've not given them birthday presents and Christmas presents and things like that, or cards, or you haven't made those connections that are attempted to make those types of connections. Okay, so where is the dispute then? Okay, why do you think there's a dispute in the abandonment area? I mean, you didn't come around, right?
I suppose the father could use the excuse if they didn't know where the child was, or.
Okay, so it's not abandonment. It might look like abandonment on the surface, but I didn't even know that I had a kid, right? So it looks like I abandoned them, but I didn't even know they existed, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Or the mother takes off with the kid, might be an example, right? Or vice versa, it could be mom, and keeps the kid away from the parent.
Mm-hmm.
That's not abandonment though, right? If you're willingly keeping me away from my child, that's not abandonment if I'm trying to get there. The biggest question usually comes out that is when a biological parent attempts over and over and it's blocked continuously, and then they give up. Okay, because it's not worth the fight all the time to try to do it. then you have a big claim of whether or not it's actually abandonment. When now 6 months pass and you never even call anymore. So now it's been 6 months. Is that abandonment? There's a big dispute comes out of that, right? So it's like, well, you kept me from my child, but I tried for a long time, but you didn't come around. You stopped, so you must not have cared. And it's like, well, at some point, I don't want to just fight all the time, that kind of thing.
Wouldn't he or she have a strong case though in that situation to be able to show the court proof of documented attempts?
Okay, yeah, sometimes, but it gets complicated because it's almost a your word versus mine situation, because we usually don't have a good paper trail of those kinds of things. But yeah, they could potentially have the case, and that's all the dispute. That's where the dispute comes in.
Right.
So, any questions in that area? There are two cases that are famous that people know about when it comes to these kinds of things, when it comes to consent, and it's the Baby Richard case. And I think Baby Richard is the one where the dad didn't know about that. Dad knew that baby was on the way. Mom tells dad that baby is died at childbirth, but mom adopted baby away. That's just Richard. Then it turns out that mom was just really unhappy at dad for cheating on her, or her allegedly having another love interest or whatever. And when she finds out that she wants him back or whatever, she tells dad that, well, the baby is adopted and I didn't let you know. So he comes back in, and now he challenges the adoption, and he gets the kid back. And I forget how old Baby Richard was. That one was a fairly quick turnaround. But then you have the one that was Baby Jessica, and it's another one similar to that. Basically, mom lied about who dad was, and then turned out, and she did tell him, and then later they actually took the kid back and gave it to the biological father, who did not consent to the adoption. Basically, what the court said in that case was that, well, the biological parent still gets primary rights. The whole discussion usually is, well, you were adopted into a good home. What's wrong with the home? And it's like, now you're fighting against two rights. Dad's wanting to be parents, and new parents, adopted parents want to be parents, and you have a fight event against two good, people, good homes. And then it's like, it sounds terrible because you're ripping the baby. It feels like you're ripping the baby away from the only home they ever knew. Well, while that's true, it doesn't make it, law can only go so far in dealing with those kind of situations. Okay, any questions about adoption? Me either. All right, so let's take up quickly, if I can pull it up here, another section that has to do with the new science of motherhood. And I ask you on this statement, on this outline, courts generally deal with establishing paternity, but how do they deal with establishing maternity, right? So that's really, in a nutshell, what this whole section is about. What is the science of motherhood, right? So historically, not a question we need to ask. Who is mom, right? We know who mom is, right? I hope we have a good idea. I mean, there's obviously, I've seen movies with alien babies and things like that, but you get the idea, right? This is not really a question. We know who mom is. We also have from time to time moms who say, well, I didn't know I was pregnant, and then they have the baby that morning, right? They wake up in the morning and they have a baby. We have those kinds of cases, and we still know who mom is, though, right?
How does that work?
It's possible. I don't know how exactly. Oh, that's a good question. Marissa asks, does this deal with switched at birth situations? In the science part of this motherhood question, no, it doesn't really deal with switched at birth, but you raise a really good question. There was a girl that in Florida, my grandmother actually was a substitute teacher in the high school where this girl was. She was like 14 when they discovered that and argued out the case that she was switched at birth with another family, and the court moved her to her biological family when she was age 14. Really, those become genetic questions as opposed to this actual science of motherhood. And what we're talking about in this area has to do with how you become pregnant and whether or not it is yours biologically, even though in some of these situations, mom carries the baby the full term, but it's not genetically, biologically the mom's kid, okay? And how do we get that? We get that through donor eggs.
Surrogacy.
Okay? We have donor eggs. We also have
How about
the non-donor eggs, where we use then some kind of different fertilization. We use fresh embryos versus frozen embryos, and all of those things that we now used to, we wear sperm banks, but there are also, egg banks and all of those kinds of things that now have opened the doors. It has to do with really helping reproduction. And that's why they call it that ART, the assisted reproductive technology. I think that there's some irony in the author's use of that term because the acronym then becomes the art of motherhood, I suppose, right? I think they did that intentionally. They used art as the acronym for this area because now you're creating your masterpiece, I suppose. I thought that was ironic when I read it. You all probably didn't even notice. You thought, what a big word for what it is, right? In any event, we are aware of these techniques. People that are having difficulty conceiving on their own, naturally, it's good where science has gone and allows those things. The most common type we're aware of is in vitro fertilization, IVF. Basically, you remove eggs and you combine this with the sperm in a petri dish, and then you transfer that back into the uterus. Okay. What is that? That's the I can't even think of it. Anyway, you understand. You make it, and you know how it works. Usually that costs per IVF treatment. It may be more than this now, but it's it's thousands of dollars, $10,000 to $15,000 per cycle. You take a lot of extra. I'm drawing blanks on all the names for this stuff, but
So don't look at me. I don't know what I'm talking about.
bobbing and weaving over there around the monitor. But you have IVF and you're taking fertility drugs. There we go. I could have come up with that. But anyway, you are assisting the process basically. Then I don't really care if you know these things, but you have gamete intrafallopian transfer. That's when you actually cut in and deliver the. Anyway, you get the idea. Zygote is actually when that's zygote intrafallopian transfer. That's the fertilized egg being put into the fallopian tubes. Okay, you can have embryo transplants. Okay, you get that idea. You have artificial insemination, which is we know what that is. I think we know natural and artificial ways, I'm sure. The questions that come up in the law area, so that's just a little bit of framework, has to do with who receives custody of frozen embryos when you're married and then you get divorced, for instance. So you've frozen these embryos, and then who gets them? Whose are they to use? And it leads us to the next question is, what about posthumous reproduction? So you have babies conceived after the death of a parent. Not born after, conceived after. What are the consequences legally from that? Well, the courts have not really dealt with this very well because our law is not established to deal with those kinds of circumstances, because does it make sense, the whole concept of custody rights and child support and all those things is based on my ability as the kid to appreciate and enjoy the lifestyle of the parent and continue that after divorce, right? Do I really have that if my parent died before I was conceived? Have I ever enjoyed that lifestyle? Am I changing anything? Right? All of those have all kinds of consequences in the law that are complicated. And there's no commentary at all about whether or not people have valid reasons for doing this. It's just that the law has not evolved easily on these concepts because what do we do? Okay, so let me get you to the next thing, and that is, what is the key word for the day? And that's surrogacy. Okay, surrogacy. And that is a very popular subject really today, is surrogacy, natural birth through using a surrogate parent mother, right? Okay, so someone else is through the gestational process and all of that till birth, and that's a surrogacy. Usually what we have is through artificial insemination or through IVF, but we also have seen cases that are legitimate where there is NI, and NI stands for natural insemination. So in other words, the old-fashioned way, where that's appropriate too. But remember, we talked about a case involving child support and whether or not the state was willing to waive the child support in those cases. You have to still do this the legal way. Otherwise, it doesn't help you much. Okay? Then we get into the problem that in the legal terminology, we have the surrogate mother. That is not the person who would be the parent at birth. That would be the intended parent. Okay? And we have some complicating factors in that stuff, in those areas. We have traditional surrogacy and gestational surrogacy. Because the science has changed now, we actually have some people. The old way of surrogacy was the mother was the pregnant for someone else. So the mother's eggs, okay, the surrogate's eggs are used and inseminated usually by the intended father, right? Because that's the mixture. And then they basically are having a regular pregnancy. Okay, it's just at the end of it, the agreement is that you will then give the rights to that child to the mother, the intended mother. Okay, what happens then if surrogate mother says no? I don't know. What does happen? I'm sure that's stuff of movies already, right?
Yes.
What happens? Whose baby is it? Sounds a heck of a it sounds like it's the surrogate's baby, doesn't it? Does then dad have to pay child support to the surrogate?
Can surrogates petition adoption? I mean, or are they already considered the natural parent?
Well, I mean, if you make a deal, the whole thing is that there's a contract that you will carry this baby to term, and then, you've done that as part of this agreement, and then you say no, then dad is on the hook for child support, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though the surrogate mother, has breached the contract. Law doesn't deal with that very well because that's a very emotional process. Having a pregnancy and those things, that's not just something we can say, yes, I can agree to that before I'm pregnant and I'm willing to do it, and at the end I will definitely give the child away, right? Is that even a fair result that we then require mom, who is biological mom, by the way, to give up the child when now mom doesn't want to?
Well, if she agreed to it and it's a contract, isn't she bound by the terms?
I know, but but she didn't know yet. She'd never been pregnant. She didn't know what it was going to be like.
I know,
And
but
she entered this deal before she was pregnant, by the way, because that's the deal. What do we do? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I'm just throwing it out there. What do you think the deal is?
I have no idea.
Well, that's a solid answer.
Sounds like a confusing game of hot potato to me.
Right. Well, what would you argue? Well, could you argue contract principles? Yeah, but doesn't it sound like illegal subject matter? How do you argue contracts? Now do we argue another contract principle here? Like unjust enrichment or something? Unconscionable? Is it unconscionable for me to make a deal that you would have my baby, as a surrogate? Maybe it is, right?
Oh, man.
It gets to get complicated. So, of course, then what the states had to do was make it legal in those states where they allow it, and otherwise you can't enforce the contract. But again, should we enforce the contract? This could be a pretty extreme case of buyer's remorse, right? And by the way, if you've never seen a surrogacy contract, they're pretty detailed. You have to eat what I tell you to eat and take care of yourself the way I tell you to take care of yourself during the pregnancy. If you want it to be an all organic diet, things like that, you'll see all kinds of things. I go to all the doctor's appointments. I go to the ultrasounds. I'm right in the middle of all of it.
Wow.
Right? There's a movie about it it's a comedy, right? Baby Mama. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty funny. Anyway, have you seen it? It's got Tina Fey and Amy Poehler in it. Anyway. So anyway, they're pretty detailed about what you have to do and all that. So anyway, I don't know. These are difficult questions, I think. So the question is, that's a safe word. We don't have safe words. Let's go with keyword for the day is surrogacy. I like baby mama that too. That's pretty good. But surrogacy, let's make it that. So how have the courts decide who was the legal mother? Well, they've looked at three main factors. One is the genetics, and they said, so if I have a gestational surrogacy, which means essentially the surrogate is not the biological mother because the mother, the egg is implanted, and then then the surrogate is carrying someone else's baby in essence. Okay, then you're not genetically the parent. So genetically, on that factor, we would say you're not, and it's the other people's baby. Okay. Gestation, though, if you look at that factor and you say, well, I carried the baby to term. If we look at that factor, then it's on the side of the surrogate. Okay. Then we look at the intent of the parties and we say, well, what was your decision? Okay. Anyway, courts really are just juggling with these, and they hope that you figure it out, I think. I'm sure they come up with the results that not everyone loves, but that's the court's job. They have to make those decisions that don't always make people's day. Okay, so any questions about any of that stuff? This subject is just to be introduced to it. Here's what's going on in the world, in the complicating factors of the science of motherhood. When again, I'm going to zip back to the top and say, courts know how to deal with paternity, but how do you deal with maternity? So we only have probably, if we go back in the Old English law, we can go back probably the Magna Carta about paternity actions. So we go back a long way, right? Several centuries. But how far can we go back to find law on maternity? Not very far, right? Because the answer is pretty simple until more recently. So, any questions about that? Okay, that's all on all this. Next time, don't forget to do your research and your assignment on torts and family law, and we'll talk about that next time. I will give you some more details about what the presentation might be for the final project, or for the course project. Okay?
Alrighty.
See ya.